Thank you, Bill, and I appreciate those comments. There's exactly the way I wrote those. But it is a pleasure to be here today, and folks ask, well, why would somebody from Kansas ever end up in Chicago? Chicagoland. Bill is right, we're not in the city, and of course that was the question that came directly from my wife. We uprooted our family and moved because just like you, we care about what's happening with our country. I spent 20 years in elective office. And I will tell you, there's some real challenges, and I hope there's still some legislators here because much of my discussion here will be what your responsibilities and what your opportunities are on so many of these issues. And I often got asked, particularly back in the state legislature, I served 14 years in the state senate, and I've come home from a week in Washington. I never stayed a weekend there because my home and family always remained in Kansas. And there's my family, by the way, and come home and said, I'd get asked, what's Washington like? Is everything you expected it to be? I said, oh yes, and much worse. And after 6 years, that's still the same thing. And it is a swamp. The president is right. And there's a little, let me get this, I want to make sure you know what I always kind of remember. I'm still a farmer. There's my brother and I. And if you've anybody ever been to Kansas? I see a few folks. Actually, there was a study a few years ago, and usually they're driving through to Colorado, by the way, but the study was comparing the variation of a pancake to the landscape of Kansas, and they have proven that there's more variation on a pancake than there is the landscape of Kansas. So truly, we are flatter than a pancake in the state of Kansas. And where I come from, you can see for about 20 miles. In this picture here, you can see about 5 miles. It's interrupted by a tree that occasionally is in the way, which is very rare. But I want to talk about a couple issues. And first, I'll start with healthcare. And I will tell you the experts that were talking when I came in covered many of those things. But actually, I'm going to start with environment and a few things. As you might know, the Heartland Institute has been well known for many years and cussed for many years and discussed and attacked for being one of the principal proponents of actually having science in the science debate over climate science. Can you imagine that? If you're going to talk about climate science, you actually talk about the science. Up here is a little bit about the politics of that, of all the quote-unquote scientists or wannabes or vice presidents or whatever you want to call them that made claims about what has happened. If you look back, and don't forget in the early 70s, I was born in 1968, so that was at the very beginning of what was then going to be a massive ice age. They actually were predicting a massive ice age. Time magazine was talking about that, and they were still talking about that by the year 2000. But if you look through that and you see in each of these years about global warming, rising sea levels, it was 10 years ago Al Gore predicted within 10 years we will have unforeseen man-made disasters because of CO2, and the world will be almost ended. The seas will be climbing up and overrunning his beachfront property, which, by the way, he did buy beachfront property after he made the pronouncement. What the Heartland has tried to do, and predecessor Joe Bast and I think the Georgia Public Policy Foundation tries to do this, is find out in the public space arena what's missing in the debate. What issues are not covered? What things on issues of freedom and liberty and free markets aren't being covered? And in the issue of environment and the claims from the alarmists, there was not a lot of scientific discussion. There's plenty of science out there, but we were always attacked that you don't know the science. Well, without a doubt, today, if you look at the data, the science is settled. There's no man-made disaster caused by CO2. And I will say as a farmer, I'm a little biased. I do like CO2. We just tend to use it every single day. Actually, CO2 is not a bad thing, Mr. Former Vice President. But what we have seen since Donald Trump took office is three very good steps forward. One is withdrawal from the Paris Accords. Number two was decrying that there is no social cost of carbon, because all these agencies were directed to somehow determine that carbon dioxide, they like to call it carbon, but carbon dioxide had a social cost. Ladies and gentlemen, actually the science is on the other side. We actually have a greening of the earth, probably because we do have an enhanced CO2 levels. And the third thing happened just recently had to do with the Clean Power Plan, which hinged on a claim that CO2 was a pollutant. We're still waiting to see what happens on the endangerment finding, which will impact all this debate. But one thing I told Mr. Bast, and I was at the White House 2 weeks ago visiting with some friends there, and that is really nice, having friends in the White House compared to serving up there for 6 years. But when you walk in there, the first picture you see when you come in from that wing is a picture of when Donald Trump announced they were going to withdraw from Paris. And we're going to take our own steps forward. And that was a huge step forward for free markets. It's a huge step forward for science. And for those of us that actually want to develop and grow our economy and provide growth for our future and for our children, that is a massive step forward. So what we've seen out of Washington, just a quick note, is there is hope in the heartland. And what it does show in terms of my predecessor, Joe Bassett, if you actually focus and really put your mind to it and identify what needs to be done, you can actually make those changes. So actually, Joe Bass was at the Rose Garden announcement. As a libertarian, he kind of didn't want to be there too badly, but it was a fantastic step forward, and it makes all the sense in the world. And I will tell you, Mr. Pruitt's done a fantastic job, and it makes sense when you come from a state level. And he, multiple times, had sued the EPA. Now he's on the other side, actually pushing forward, I think, and reestablishing science back at the EPA. But as you can guess, some folks are really upset about it. But frankly, they've been wrong again and again. The second issue I'd like to talk about, if I can get this going the right way, is about education and about education choice. This is a gal named Anita. And you might ask, why is Anita crying? Why is Anita crying? Well, she just learned when this picture was taken, she just had learned that her 6-year-old son had been accepted into a school choice program. Ladies and gentlemen, one thing we can't forget as we work about this room, and Jonathan Williams is a friend of mine, he talks about taxes. As a former congressman, I talk about things that seem really very important and grandiose. What it comes back to, though, is to remember, particularly on education, it's about mothers and fathers just like Anita and their children that want to have a better school. They want to have a better choice. And I served 14 years in the state legislature, and we never had one single opportunity that we ever got choice passed. There's very few choices in Kansas, but what you see across the nation is that folks like Anita are standing up and saying, and this is not your typical member of a free market foundation, a free market group, or folks even that are conservative libertarian, saying we need to make certain that they have a choice and that we respect their choice and respect that Anita wants a better life for her 6-year-old son. And you can see that. And I see across the nation, particularly with the new secretary, that we have new opportunities to promote choice in education opportunities. And I know you're doing that right here in the state of Georgia. Give folks an opportunity, put even more away for a tuition tax credit and for scholarship programs to match up a McKay-type scholarship. Let's make that happen. Because they are working. All the studies show it. Because, and I would tell you, my wife and I, we've tried, I think, every educational opportunity type in the world. I think for our 11-year-old, we wonder if any of them will ever work. And he is quite rambunctious, but we've done the public school, we've done the home school, we've done the virtual school, the virtual public school, and then we've taken a lot of time off in the meantime. But that's the key. Every educational study, and we've got a chairman of the Heartland Board, is an expert on this. Every study shows what is the principal factor that makes a difference in education. I listened to Senator Ben Sass last Friday, and we're talking about how important the teacher is. And yes, those are very important, which is why choice really does work as well. But the single most important factor is Anita, is the parent. And if we want to improve education, if you don't include the parent, the guardian, mom, dad, grandparent, whoever's in charge of the child, you can't actually improve that education system long term. So we're going to continue to work on that. I encourage your opportunities here in the state of Georgia as well. And because I know it's difficult. I know I served in the state legislature, and the single largest power in about every state legislature, of course, is the education lobby. And they don't want to change anything. I will tell you, for legislators, you probably have heard this same story. I would have principals come to me, and teachers would come the next day. So the principals would be lobbying for something, and then the teachers union would show up. But they always agreed on one thing. The answer to all their problems always was more money. More money. More money. And I talked to the principals and said, well, wouldn't you like to get rid of reduce some paperwork and overhead and those requirements? Well, absolutely. And the way you do that is with more money. It was never ending to break that down. But if you look across, my kids right now are actually in Catholic school. So there's choice that is developing and growing, and however the Heartland can be helpful to that. What we do, amongst many other things, reaching out, and we are based outside of Chicago, as was mentioned, but we actually touch all 50 states. We mail a school reform news in every legislator's mailbox every month, or 11 months out of the year. We do that with Environment News and a couple other publications. And I'm going to tell you, as a I think fairly of a technological geek, I don't know why we were still publishing those, but what we found out is 70% of state legislators still read things that come in the mail. And maybe in a few years, the newspaper from Heartland may be the only thing they get in writing, but they're influenced by that. And what we do is take our free market news, all the great successes as well as the failures, and give that out to state legislators to give them ammunition to work on education to help mothers just like Anita. And I think, and I hope, and for the next future of the movement for freedom, that's where it has to happen. That's where they have to learn. And my fifth grader comes home reading his weekly reader last night, and being in the Heartland Institute, it seems like they always have a climate change section in there. Ladies and gentlemen, they own the weekly reader business. The other side does. And they're not getting the truth there. And so we have to rely on a curriculum and control from our parents that walk in and say, hey, this is what I want to see in my child's education. Third issue I'd like to talk about, let's see if this even works anymore. We did have a little sound with that, but anybody remember this fax modem? When I went in the legislature in 1996, and I had the sound here, I was going to play that for you. Remember the dial-up modem sound? That was 1996 when I started in the legislature. In the state of Kansas, just that year, they had changed the definition of what broadband was. Before that time, the spring of 1996, broadband was 56K. 56K. For years, the government said, broadband connection, you've got 56K, it qualified. Well, they updated. I think they doubled it that year in the state legislature. And Congress in Washington was about the same level as well. I know you're having debates over this as in the state level here. And broadband access is critical. It's critical to education. It's critical to business. But the question we have as free market believers is how do you make that happen? How do you make sure that we have access? And I come from, a very rural area of Kansas. And we have a lot of rural telecom providers. And I will note they do come up, as an aside, they'd come up to me and say, well, Tim, we don't quite have broadband everywhere. And they'd always want more money. I get that. But one thing I would always tell them that the technology is going to change. The last thing we want to do at the state level or federal level is dictate how we get to whatever goal we're going to get to. Because the technology is going to change. It's going to change in 6 months. It's going to change in 12 months. It's certainly going to change from 1996 to the present. And I would encourage you, as you look at these things, think about the 56K modem, because that was considered, that's how we were going to deliver broadband. You know, we have satellite, and most of Georgia and most of Kansas has broadband connection, but back when the small telecom providers would come in and say, well, Congressman or State Senator, we need to expand that. And what's interesting is a note, I said, well, what's the highest usage you have? Is it for business? Is it for education? Is it for healthcare, which I'd like to talk a little bit later? They said, no, the biggest demand is Netflix. Okay, I understand that. I've got kids. I understand that and use Netflix as well. But one has to ask, is the government should be in the business of making sure every child can watch Netflix? And I would probably say, probably not. And I would say that is really not what we're looking for. But the consumers on the other side want that. And I have teenagers. I got 2 daughters in college. Still consider them that. So they're like, I think, most consumers in America. They would love to get it for free. But at the end of the day, somebody has to pay for it. And one, make sure it's neutral in terms of technology, but also recognize that most of the pushes for some of the broadband expansion have nothing to do with economic growth and development, but entertainment. And if you want to do gaming, my daughter's a junior at college, and she was complaining yesterday of how the wireless on campus wasn't working. And I hadn't been on a college campus for obviously for a number of years. But can you imagine, for those who haven't been in college recently, can you imagine all these kids getting out of their 1 o'clock class, most of them don't do a 9 o'clock class, getting out and they go back and start streaming Netflix and start doing their gaming, and then they wonder why my daughter can't get on Blackboard to do her actual work. But that's a principle just to keep in mind. What's the proper function? What's the proper role of government as we move forward? And I come from a very, very rural area, as I mentioned, and certainly broadband access is key in many cases to economic growth and development. I will say my hometown was 500 folks. I don't know why anybody would want to live anywhere else, but you got to be able to make a living there. And so broadband access is important and critical, but I think we always need to focus on what's the proper role of government, and how can we make certain we don't cripple development of technology in the future. But I will tell you what I see on the technology front in state after state after state, that there is hope in the heartland because we're making a difference despite, in many cases, what's going on in Washington. And fourth issue I'd like to talk about is healthcare. And I know all the technical details. I talked to the chairwoman. I mean, I'll just say up front, you all know more than I do in terms of what we should do from a technical perspective. But here's what I do have to offer to you is that a reminder, as was Kelly had here in the great panel, is the action, ladies and gentlemen, is in the states. But I put up this slide here. I had a lot of difficulties working with the former president, and then we went back and forth on plenty of issues. But you know what? Far too often in government, and I was guilty of that as well, we'd make grandiose claims and seem if we pass this bill, if we do this policy, something great's going to happen. And very rarely did we ever look back and see what was the outcome. What was the outcome? You know, the CBO score of Obamacare, look back, what was the outcome? They were very, very, very wrong on that. And of course, the president himself, really, did they really believe premiums would be lower? We can argue that all day. Obamacare, the rating by the Congressional Budget Office suggested it probably would not be lower, but the president went out and told everybody, I'm going to save you $2,500. Save you $2,500 every year for every family. And a lot of people believed it. And a lot of people believed that it was going to enhance competition. A lot of people believed that if the federal government took it over, that somehow it was going to fix all these problems. Healthcare is a difficult thing to fix. And if you look back at the history of healthcare, I argue we probably made mistakes back in World War II. And remember what happened in World War II in terms of healthcare. Before that, most of it was fee-for-service. And then the federal government decided, in the infinite wisdom at the White House at that time, that we needed to control wages because we're going to have runaway inflation. I think it might have been at 3%. We're going to runaway inflation in a wartime, and so they said, you can't raise wages. And so businesses, employers started saying, okay, as part of your benefits package, we will give you some type of health insurance plan. I think that was a mistake because, as my teenagers remind me about every day, as long as somebody else is paying the bill, there's very little control of cost. And so I think that's the case. The worst possible way to do it is centralize that in Washington. But when I went to Heartland, it was about June. They were starting getting close to debate in the Senate. I asked folks there at Heartland, including Joe Bassett was there, I said, can I go ahead and write what I think is going to happen? And we decided, well, Tim, you probably shouldn't predict the defeat of the repeal bill now. And so I didn't do that, but I will tell you, I don't think they're ever going to repeal Obamacare up there. I don't think that's going to happen. And if you're hoping on that, keep hoping. They're going to keep introducing bills. I met with Mick Mulvaney. I just said, I wish, he's the OMB director and a friend of mine. And I said, Mick, I just encourage the administration to start doing something that you can do at CMS and HHS, which they have been doing the last couple days, not because of me, but I said, please stop giving state legislators and state policymakers false hope or false impression that you're going to do something specifically to the Obamacare law. And I think the message started to get through because state after state started calling Heartland the day after the failure of the first repeal bill in the Senate. Says, what do we do now? What do we do now? There's basically been 10 years of pent-up demand for free market reforms in state after state after state, including red states and blue states, purple states. Folks say, wait a minute, Washington messed up here. They messed up here. They should have done it differently. And premiums are going up. The deductible's going up. And I visited with a lady in the state of Georgia last night. She said, well, they're talking about tax reform. The benefits for tax reform, depending how you count it, could be up to $500, maybe $1,000 a household. Well, in many places, that's their increases in their costs this year for just health care alone. This is going to get lost in that. But what I will encourage you, and the Heartland is willing and able to help us, what can you do in the state of Georgia? What can you do to enhance competition? What can you do to enhance choice in the marketplace. Let me give you an example of some things that you certainly can do, and the experts on waivers talked about that, and I visited with folks in administration, and Heartland's put out a long list of things that you could request as a state to do away with. You could do away with the employer mandate if you wanted to as a state. Just ask CMS. I would challenge you that maybe they don't want to do that, but politically I think they would have to. No state has requested that. Let's do away with the individual mandate. Let's do away with numerous other things that conservatives like myself for 6 years in Congress, we hate all those things. But we've seen very little movement on that. So we got this cross state lines. There's differing opinion on whether that helps or not. But the question I always have in terms of health care, could we really make it any worse? Could we make it even any more complicated? Could you make it even worse that it isn't directed to care? Let me give you one example of, I was always encouraging my colleagues in Washington when I was up there, said, let's actually have an Obamacare replacement bill. Well, as you know, they waited until January of this year to put it together, which, and I think it was doomed to fail the way they put it together. But for the 6 years I was up there, I was working on the other side of government health care, not the Medicaid side, not the Medicare side, not the Obamacare side, but the VA side. Now, you want to talk about what health care looks like when it fails, look at the VA system. But if you roll back about 12 to 15 years ago, all the major left-wing publications, and even some folks on our side, were pointing out how the VA system was so superb. It was fantastic. It was the model system, and you can read that in newspaper and publications. One Atlantic Monthly had a feature article. This was where we're going to head. And I encourage you to go back and look at that because they were so wrong. But here's the VA system. And I serve, my district was 70 counties in western Kansas. We had no VA facility, no facility in the district. Of course, if you're a veteran and you understand in your VA the system, where do they send you? You have to go to a VA facility until we got some VA choice in the program. And so in the case of the 1st District of Kansas, you had to drive 5 hours in many cases to the nearest VA facility. Can you imagine if you told every Medicare patient you had to drive 5 hours? If you told every Medicaid patient you have to do that? But with the way they're heading on Medicaid and Medicare and driving a lot of rural hospitals out of business, we're going to start to run into those problems of access. And the chairwoman mentioned a number of those access problems. But in the VA system, you drive literally hours for care. I had a gentleman from a little town of Syracuse, Kansas. He wanted his blood drawn. Now, you can't go to the local hospital to draw blood in Syracuse, Kansas. It's just not permitted. He literally drove by 10 different hospitals, which, by the way, I have probably way too many hospitals in western Kansas. I had more in my congressional district than any other district in the country, thanks to the government deciding in the 50s, we're going to build hospitals in every county. We've got 105 counties, so they did what they were told. They built a hospital in every county, and they're still almost there. But this gentleman drove by 10 county hospitals because the VA said we won't pay for it there. And we finally got a little bit of choice in the VA system, but if we're going to take that model and pull back from a big government centralized approach, look at where can you expand choice? Where can you put the patients back in charge? And I'm always one to say, hey, let's get everything we can when we make a legislative change. And others say, well, take a half a loaf and we'll come back there. Well, in this case, I'm absolutely confident. If you gave a veteran a choice to go to the doctor he sees in church on Sunday, you're never going to take that away from him. And same thing when you talk about patients. How can you make certain that on health care, so many other areas, they actually are able to have that choice? So I would encourage you to continue to talk about, state legislators, talk about waivers. Mick Mulvaney wanted to make this very clear. He doesn't want to spend another dime more on Medicaid. I get that. Actually, you probably could under the law, but he probably won't like that in the request. But what we're seeing over here, even with Dr. Price moving on, you still have CMS that's really focused to that. There's folks in this room that are working on those waivers. We're working with entities all across this country saying, what can you do? And we actually have engaged a consultant to put together, start the process of putting together a model waiver for state legislators. And I would tell you, state legislators, you're in a difficult position. You got a Medicaid director. And the Medicaid director always thinks they know more, and usually they do. And then you have the whole other executive apparatus on healthcare. And it's always difficult to direct that, some real healthcare reforms when you have the Medicaid system that's been around for decades. And so what we're trying to do is help legislators approach CMS directly and put together some proposals that they can put through the legislature. The CMS is saying that they expect the 1332 waiver would have to have legislative approval. I would say that's probably not quite necessary. But of course, as I mentioned, coming from Kansas, the former governor, Kathleen Sebelius, who was the HHS secretary, said there's 1,400 places that she has authority to do things on health care. So that means there's 1,400 places to roll back towards choice rather than towards government control. So think big, think long, say, what can we do? This is really a once-in-a-generation opportunity. It's certainly once in a decade. And they're looking at us. And I will tell you, the executive order yesterday, very short on details. I got numerous interviews. What's going to happen? I don't know. Will it be better than the current system? Absolutely. Can you prove that? Absolutely not. All I know is this is not working. And so we have an opportunity to really experiment, opportunity for states to do what our founding fathers intended. Was they didn't want health care to be nationalized. They couldn't even conceive of that, of course. But on issue after issue, they want to make sure that you made the decisions here in Georgia on your health care. And are your populations very similar to parts of Kansas? Sure. Are there places where it's very different? Absolutely. And how are you going to handle access issue in a rural area? Those are difficult questions. And one size doesn't fit all. But here's the time for the folks in this room and the Georgia Public Policy Foundation to say, how can we fix it? This window could shut pretty quickly in terms of the administration being open to waivers. But right now, they're very open to doing that. And so I'd be happy to visit with any legislators as we go forward and say, how can we be helpful working with the Georgia Public Policy Foundation? Because at the end of the day, on healthcare, on environment, on education and technology, hope is in the heartland. And I spent 6 years in Washington, and it's still the same today, is the real action, the real opportunities for growth, and actually reinvigorating a freedom movement in this country actually is here in Georgia. It's every state in this union. So now's the time to get involved, time to get engaged, and we can absolutely make a difference. And I can see it, I can feel it in so many issue areas. And with that, I'm going to open up to questions if I still have time, Kelly. And I will tell you, as a former legislator or recovering politician, I think I did like 400 town halls in my 6 years in Congress and hundreds before then. So that's the ultimate of us working together in our individual states and saying there's some friends in Washington in the right places that are ready and willing to help us innovate and do the right thing on these issues. So however we want to handle questions, go ahead and get started, Kelly. Got a microphone going around here.
Hi, thank you, Congressman. Jesse Wellington from Total Spectrum. I was wondering if you might elaborate on the amount of detail you guys are contemplating putting the states into the 1332 waivers actually at the legislative stage versus the administration or program stage.
Yeah, and we're just beginning that project. We do have a consultant that works on, that we're trying to partner with, that works on drawing up and is currently involved in multiple states on Medicaid waivers. And being a former legislator, well, can we do this? Yes. Can we do this? Can we do this? Can we do the employer individual mandate? Can we do this? Can we do this? The answer is always yes. And because of these 1,400 spots in Obamacare that says you can do plenty of things. But politically, the question is this: do they want to do that? I think they do. But coming from a red state, that I'm from, can you imagine any state asking the administration, can we waive the employer mandate? Put that in writing. Can you imagine the Trump administration saying, no? They might. But I think, and how do you tie that in? But again, it's not just doing away with it. It's how do we fashion a healthcare system that restores consumer and patient choice? And the system is not as broken as the VA system. But what we learned from the last 6 years that I was in Washington, how difficult it is to pull out and restore choice in a system that years ago lost choice. Remember when veterans came back, I was visiting a veteran, was up on an honor flight, and we were talking, and he was from, originally from, I think, it was North Dakota, and he'd retired in Kansas. When he came back from service, they assigned him to the nearest VA facility. He happened to be from North Dakota. If I remember, the nearest VA hospital is 500 miles away. That was where he's supposed to go to get his health care. Of course, that's how they play the game, so they don't cost them as much because they don't show up for health care. So, but the answer is we can do a lot of things, and working with that consultant, working with multiple states. Heartland has legislative forum members in 43 different states. We mail into 50 different states. We have our Emerging Issues Forum next month in Houston, and we're going to be hopefully able to present a pretty robust model waiver that states can go on, the innovation waiver and the Medicaid, both sections. So I think, and what we're seeing is probably roll those together and can move forward. I will tell you, I'm not the expert on that. That's what we call a consultant in. I'm just saying, hey, can we do this? And we're going to push and push, because this is an opportunity. And I'll repeat again, this window could close in a year for whatever reason. Take your pick on the policy. It's a very, very tense, risky political business right now. And so now's the time to get what we've been trying to do in healthcare for a long time. Yes, sir.
Congressman, full disclosure, Kevin Curtin, I work for AT&T, but one of the problems, I enjoyed what you had to say about broadband. One of the issues we deal with on a continuous basis is one of the barriers to deploying broadband is, quite frankly, just the taxes, fees, and costs usually imposed by local governments or bureaucratic processes put in place by local governments that get in the way of enhancing broadband coverage in all parts of the state, quite frankly. So what things can states do to try to reduce those barriers to additional broadband investments?
Well, a lot of states used to have a lot of licensing requirements, particularly for new cable providers. That was a big push 10 or 15 years ago, and maybe that was before you guys were in that part of the business. But taxes and fees, but the regulations. And what we're seeing at Heartland is that not as much as state level push, but you got local units. You know, the worst thing to do, of course, would be allow the local government to own the broadband. So, there's one case in Vermont. We're just writing about that this week. You know, they lost $50 million on this deal or something, and it's just outrageous because they can't run it. Yeah, but what we're seeing is the local folks. What I would encourage the state legislators to make certain, it depends on your state laws, make certain that localities couldn't come in and put in additional burdens and regulations on top of this. Because, ladies and gentlemen, we're in the 21st century. We've got folks in many of these cities, they might still have dial-up if they had their way. But just don't forget, just the mindset should be, if we wait 6 months, things are going to change. And maybe that's the message. Encourage you to state and localities. Says, okay, you might want to do that, but let's wait 6 months. In 6 months, it might be totally different. In 6 months, Microsoft won't be doing their little deal that they're trying to do. And I don't know if that's going to work, but the point is, about the time government figures out what they want to do, it's too late. We're already on to the next technology. And similarly on so many other arenas. So I hope that answers your questions, but it's taxes, but it's the regulatory nature. And whether or not cross-state purchases of health insurance, how that works on the marketplace. I heard from the experts here that didn't know if it'd be helpful. But those are artificial barriers on the technology as well, and it's hard. And I served on my district was with Oklahoma, and oftentimes you always talked about it. But at the end of the day, people were going back and forth, and technology went back and forth, and we have to understand that as policymakers. Good luck on the pulling together the new conglomerate. So please make sure we don't have folks in Washington determining what's actually the content of that. So, questions? Well, Kelly, I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and thank you for the work that you do, and for whether you're a policymaker or folks involved in the industry. Again, Heartland's in every state, and we're trying to influence folks to recognize the value of freedom and opportunity, and what can happen when you unleash that. If there's any way we can be helpful to that, we will continue to be the hope in the Heartland and enjoy working with you guys. So thank you.